Hi, we're going to continue our talk with the Databricks DevOps using GitHub Actions to deploy your Databricks environment in Azure. So we're going to talk about the Databricks deployment in detail. So I'm assuming you've watched the Service Principal video for GitHub and configured your Service Principal. You've watched the initialize Key Vault, and you've deployed your artifacts. So basically everything at this point is now deployed. So really you want to review what happened and how you move forward doing this with your own Databricks environment. So the first piece here is we have ARM templates. So this is the repo clone from GitHub. So inside here, we have two ARM templates. We have a Databricks ARM template. So this is going to deploy your Databricks workspace. And we have a Key Vault ARM template. And this will deploy your Key Vault. And it basically creates the 4 secrets we need. It puts in some placeholder values so you can go ahead and replace them. So most people will probably take the Databricks template here and add a VNet. So you might want to add a variable to join a specific VNet, but we're not going to go over that here. This is just a basic ARM template without the VNet. So you put your ARM templates in the ARM templates folder. We have clusters. So if you ever create a cluster in the Databricks UI, you'll notice there's a little JSON button in there. If you click that JSON button, you can actually see the JSON. So what you need to do is when you create your clusters in Databricks, you need to go grab that JSON, and then there'll be an extra tag in here that says something like cluster ID or something, because it creates a cluster ID with some values in here. So you will need to remove the cluster ID tag because our cluster IDs will change per environment. So we don't want it in our JSON. We just want the JSON for each of the clusters you want. And then the easiest way to do this is really configure it in the workspace in the UI, or you can check out the Databricks definition for this, and that will show you what you need to put inside this JSON. So we're not going to save the changes. So underneath here, you might have small, medium, large clusters, whatever you want to name them. I will say the name here is important. We'll reference this name later on, so we'll make a note of that now. So you will create all your clusters you want and keep them in source control. So we made sure we removed the cluster ID. Also init scripts. So some people push out initialization scripts. So these are scripts that will run on your cluster before it's allocated or during the allocation process. So for instance, if you wanted to copy jar files from storage or upload jar files and put them on a cluster, you can do some of that inside your init script. So these are for customizing your clusters. So there's a sample one that's included. It doesn't really do anything, but it does get deployed. And then jobs. So jobs is, you'll probably be deploying jobs inside here. So I have two JSONs. One's a interactive JSON. So again, you can look at the jobs JSON on the Databricks REST API documentation. And the only thing unique about this is there's an existing cluster ID, and note it says small. So when we deploy our cluster small, it might get an ID of 1, 2, 3, 4. And then when we deploy our job, the deployment will actually replace the word small with 1, 2, 3, 4. So it does do basically a lookup based upon that name small to look up the cluster ID in your environment. And then when you're in your environment, the two are linked together successfully. There's an on-demand cluster, which most jobs are typically on-demand, and it just says new cluster, and it gives you the same set of attributes that are similar to the cluster JSON. So jobs can get deployed through this. And then the last one are notebooks, which I didn't put here. So notebooks also get deployed, and we'll review a little bit how to set these up in source control. But underneath my notebooks folder. These are all my notebooks. So I have a SQL notebook, Python notebook, various nested folders. And these were set up, and I'll create a video on how to set up source control with Databricks, but these are linked to source control from your Databricks workspace. So as you make changes to your notebooks, you have the ability to check in those changes to your Git repo, and they're saved automatically in Git. So that's actually the integration part between Databricks and source control, but jobs, init scripts, and clusters, there's no native integration inside of Databricks where if you create a cluster, you can sort of right click and say add to source control. That does not exist. So you do need to manually add clusters, init scripts, and jobs to your Git repo, and then your notebooks will be linked through Databricks to persist into this repo. So you don't need to import these or anything. You just need to set up that configuration for source control. And for jobs, there's some sample APIs. So there's a sample REST API to Databricks. And if you wanted to get a list of all your jobs, you can come in here and replace your tenant token, your secret, and then this will log into Databricks using the REST API and your Azure credentials. It will actually get your workspace URL. So every time you deploy a Databricks cluster now, it gets a unique URL. And then what it will do here is actually list out your clusters, or you can come here and change this to jobs, and it will get a list of all your jobs. So if you don't want to go sort of figure out author all your jobs by hand, you can come in here, do a curl command, get a list of jobs, and then cut and paste that JSON in here separately, since this will be an array of jobs. So it is a little bit of work to get some of those pieces in there, but once you have it set up, you can cut and paste jobs pretty easily between the JSON. Just clone that JSON and then change the name of the job. So we went through the artifacts inside here. There's a README, a PowerPoint presentation, and there's a sample REST API call that you can use to sort of test your connection to Databricks through the REST API. And then the main other piece here is the deployment scripts. So these are a set of scripts I created for deploying each one of these. So I'll go through each one of these in the same order. So clusters. So inside here, we're going to receive values, and I'm going to go through the workflow in a minute. But we need to pass in our tenant, client ID, secret subscription, resource group, and workspace name. So these four are for contacting the REST API, and then these three are used for computing your workspace name. So again, when you deploy a Databricks cluster, you'll have a workspace and you won't know the name of it. There's a Azure Databricks Resource ID. So this is static. So this is just hard-coded, and you keep it as hard-coded. And we need this resource ID to go look up our REST endpoint. If you notice, we're getting a resource ID to our Databricks workspace, which will be our subscription name, our resource group, and we'll have our workspace name. So we need this information to go figure some information out. So the first thing we do is get an access token. So we log in to Azure, and the resource we're trying to contact is this resource ID GUID. So this is saying, go get a access token that has access to this resource. Then we also need to get a management token. And this is your normal call if you've done REST APIs to Azure. This logs you in with the service principal to talk to the Azure portal or the Azure REST API. So these two tokens are needed. And then we're going to call in to Azure and get the workspace URL. So the workspace URL will come back as some weird value dot, and then go on from there with your cluster. But we need to get that workspace URL. So this will call over to the Azure uh, REST API. It will look up your workspace. So out here will be a workspace name. And then what we'll do is we'll use JQ, which is a JSON parser in Bash, and it will grab the workspace URL and we'll get the raw output. And you can run all these by hand. So this entire DevOps process can be run by hand locally. So in this case, this is going to return back. I have a sample of a URL it should return. So go ahead and, if you want to understand this in detail, I would run these scripts by hand. And you can just, the main thing is when you run these by hand, they assume you are in the appropriate directory. So if you're deploying your clusters, it's assuming that you're in your clusters directory, and then you say dot dot, deploy clusters and pass in your variables. So when we deploy our clusters, we have we're going to use Bash purely, and one of the enhancements I had on my website was to write this in PowerShell as well. But for now, we're going to use Bash. And the first thing we do is get a list of clusters from the Databricks workspace. So a couple key points here is we pass in our access token, which is that GUID reference token, and then we pass in our management token, and we pass in our resource ID. So this is using the Azure Service Principal to contact the Databricks REST API. So that code actually will go ahead and get a list of clusters. And then what we want to do is we want to find all the files in the current directory. And this will handle spaces inside file names and various things like that. So if you go crazy with file names, it might not work, but spaces and other values are handled. And then this will be printing out your names, and it's going to basically get the cluster file name. So we're going to, for each file in that cluster directory, we're going to cat it, and we're going to get the cluster name with JQ. And then we're going to see if this cluster name exists in the list of clusters up here. So if that cluster exists, we have to do an update. If it's new, we have to do a create. So basically we're coming here and we're saying create the cluster, and we're going to pass in pretty much the same access tokens here, and we're going to pass in the file name to create a cluster. If it exists, we have to update it. So if we have an existing cluster, what we need to do is we need to inject the cluster ID. So we looked up the cluster ID here, and it said cluster 1234, and then we want to say, let's take the JSON that doesn't have the cluster ID in it. So over here, this JSON in these clusters does not have a cluster ID, so we're going to inject this value into the cluster ID. So let me get back to where we were. So we'll now have a new JSON, and we're going to post that new JSON to the edit command. So we basically are doing a create cluster or edit cluster. Now what we're going to do is sleep for a few seconds, so 15 seconds here, just to make sure, because we want to get the cluster list again. And the reason we're going to get the cluster list is we're going to stop all the clusters. So we're going to loop through here, do the very similar lookup on JSON. JQ will let you do some queries on cluster IDs. And then we call delete, which is not actually deleting the cluster. It's a terminate. So delete means stop. There's actually a separate REST API to physically remove the cluster. So this script is going to log into Azure. It's going to look up the workspace. It's going to deploy our clusters. So it's going to either do a create or it's going to do an update. And if it doesn't update, it needs to know the cluster ID. And then it's going to stop all the clusters since we don't want to leave them running. So that's the first part of the script. The next one is the Init Scripts. This one's a little easier. Again, this part of the script is all the same up to the top, same set of parameters. And then what we're going to do here is we're going to make a directory. My directory is typically called dbfs init script path. You'll see right here it's hard coded. You probably want to just keep that consistent across all your workspace. So just pick one name and go with it. You can create subfolders in there, but you probably don't need to change that name much in terms of different deployments to keep things consistent. So it will make that path on dbfs if it does not exist. And then it's going to just list out the files out there, and then it's going to upload each of those init scripts, and then it does another listing. So you can sort of see a before and after debug steps. You don't need the before and after listings, but I just did it for debugging purposes. And then you'll have your init scripts inside of dbfs. The next one is deploying jobs. So deploying jobs has a little more complication in terms of the algorithm, and I've documented that up here. We have to look up a cluster ID for jobs that have an interactive cluster. So this code is all the same in terms of getting the workspace URL. And then what we need to do is, it says deploy clusters, but I'll have to change that to deploy jobs. So change that right now. So we need to get a list of clusters, and then we need to get a list of jobs. So we need two lists, so we know if we're going to basically edit a job or create a job. And if we're going to create a job, we need to check to see if it's an interactive cluster. And if it's an interactive cluster, we need to go get the cluster ID. So this logic here will find the job name, and then it's going to determine, the lookup cluster names based upon if that job has a element called existing cluster ID. And then we're going to check for errors. But then we come down here and we're going to set the existing cluster ID to the real cluster ID. So if this job, and let me show you the example here. So if we go to our jobs and we have interactive, if this has existing cluster ID as part of this JSON, what we did is we just looked up the true cluster ID of this value. So that will substitute it. And then we're going to either create a job or we're going to reset a job. We don't want to, we want to keep the job history. And when you reset a job, you actually have to take the entire job JSON and tuck it under something called new settings. So we have a couple things we need to do. We need to inject the existing job ID, which is done somewhere up here. We find the job ID, right? And we have a job ID. So once we have the existing job ID, we want to create some JSON that has the job ID right here. And then it takes the entire JSON, which is uh, this JSON here, this whole JSON gets tucked under an element called new settings. So the resulting JSON looks something like this. You'll get a job ID colon 123, and then this gets under a new settings, and then it looks something like this. And if we format that, you'll end up posting this JSON to the REST API. So the reset has a few extra tricks in it. So hopefully, if you take a look at it, you'll understand what's happening with that one. I'm going to skip those changes. I'll fix everything up after this. All right, and then the other one is notebooks. So notebooks, we'll hit deploy notebooks. So notebooks gets deployed very similar, has an extra parameter. It needs to know where to go look under get. So it needs to know this directory. Because when you link a notebook in Databricks, you can specify a path. So basically this is the path in your get repo. And that's what we want to be able to go loop through and deploy all the notebooks. So we do one step here. We recursively create paths. So inside my, minimize some of this, inside my folders, I have nested folders. So what this does is it recursively creates folders. It's calling make directory over and over again to create all the folders. And then what we do is we deploy the notebooks. So we have to set a language. So based upon the extension of the file, it needs a language of SQL, Scala, or Python. And then what we do is we actually upload or import the notebook, and we have to make sure we're in the path of the notebook and then the file name. So all this does is it takes these same set of resources here in this same structure and uploads it to Databricks under your notebooks. So that takes care of the deployment scripts. There's enough here for you to do something. Let's say you wanted to deploy a policy or some other Databricks artifact. You'd come in here and create a new deployment script called deploy policy.sh, and then cut and paste, steal the code over here and really just go look at the REST API and read in the JSON and push it up there. So there is work for doing other types of artifacts, and I'll add a few more to the repo as examples, but it's very extensible for you to just come in here, add another shell script, and then create a folder called policies, and then have that shell script upload those policies. Again, you can test all these scripts locally, so you don't need to run your DevOps process and wait for hours and hours for this thing to keep redeploying. You can test this, just open a bash prompt. If you're using Windows, download Windows Bash, and that will help you quickly run this locally. You do need JQ installed, but that's only the only requirement of these shell scripts. The other piece here is let's look at the YAML for the pipeline. I'm going to close this down. Let's save this. So this is the GitHub YAML, and it's we'll start at the top here. So what is this YAML doing? So this is our workflow. So you have your service principal, which we discussed, and we'll go through this quickly. So here's the dispatch. I have a manual dispatch. It's not a automatic every time you do a check-in. You can change it to do automatic check-ins. The GitHub documentation for actions can tell you how to change this to a trigger. But these are my parameters, and I have default parameters set. So you've seen this in the user interface if you looked at the other videos. And then I have a series of jobs. My first one's build. Everything's running on Linux, so it spins up real quick. I check out the source code, and then my favorite thing to do is show my environment variables. My number one problem I have when I do DevOps is figuring out where my files are on the DevOps computer. So this helps me make sure my paths are aligned for debugging. So you could take that out if you needed to. And then I'm going to package up my ARM templates, package up my clusters, package up my notebooks, package up my jobs. So package up my init scripts and my deployment scripts. So if you did need to compile some code in here, you would add a compile step, and then you would publish that jar file as an artifact. So that's something you would enhance if you're building code during your Databricks pipeline. To deploy to dev, this is going to be the same for QA and prod. So I have my environment name here. It needs build. This needs says don't run this until the build's done. Runs on Linux. And now here's where if you remember, if you watch the prior videos, you'll see that all my resources have a -dev extension, my resource group name, my Databricks workspace name, and my key vault name. So if you wanted to come in here and customize based upon your naming standard, you would do that in here. The other piece you would want to do is, let's say you had 3 service principals, you'd probably have a service principal name, and then you would enhance this to, right now I think my service principal was called like, uh, it could be hard coded. It was like Azure Connection, and I would probably call this one dev. All right, so if you had 3 service principals, you would come in here and customize this to have the service principal name, and then go change the template to reference this variable. So you want to just have these variables the only things that change for the rest of the steps. So if you look at my QA, it just says QA, 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 and then prod says prod, prod, prod. So I don't have to change anything except for my environment variables for this stage. I show my environment variables, and then I'm downloading all my artifacts. You can have these download in one step. Then you can log into Azure. So this will log into Azure with my credentials. So if you change that thing up there to your credentials and you wanted to underscore dev, you could, this is referencing a secret, but you could have a secret called Azure Credentials -dev. So you could do that here. Databricks Workspace. So this is deploying an ARM template. It does create the resource group. So if you're not creating the resource group, you could comment this line out, just put a # in front of it. If your resource groups are created by IT, and then it does a deployment. It always runs. You see there's an if statement here. This is sometimes just a tip if you're testing your DevOps processes. I don't like waiting for my ARM templates to run because they can take a while. So sometimes I'll come in here and put a comment to skip this step just to say I'm skipping for testing. So it makes my cycles quicker for my DevOps testing. Then I have deployed a key vault. Again, if you already had a key vault or resource group, if you already had a key vault, you can get rid of this whole step. If you already have a resource group, you could comment this out. So there's some options for that. And then this only runs when our import mode is key vault. So remember, we only ran this once in the prior videos. So this will only run once. And then we need to download the secrets, download secrets for Databricks mode. So the rest of the steps will all say Databricks mode. So it's going to download these secrets that we set. So as a comma separate list of secrets. And then we need to basically execute those 4 shell scripts. So we again have Databricks mode. I change to the corresponding folder. I then change mod, I make the shell script executable. And then I basically, I'll just, for the video, I'll put this on separate lines, but basically I'm passing in all my parameters, which are all values either derived from my ARM template, I'm sorry, derived from my GitHub Action template, or passed in as a parameter. So this same step is repeated. This is saying clusters, deploy clusters, calls clusters sh, and then we deploy our notebooks. Our notebooks get an extra parameter on the end here. So you have a notebooks deployment path. That's the path underneath the workspaces folder in Databricks. And then we deploy the jobs. So QA, same set of steps again. And if you wanted to have your service principal, I would probably, let's say your service principal was different per environment. When you log into Azure, let me just show you how to do it correctly. This would be Azure credentials. I would probably change this to _dev. And then if you wanted to do this for QA, if you scroll down to QA, you'd come here, and after you download your artifacts, you make this QA, and then you make it prod. So if you have 3 service credentials, you can support that in different subscriptions. So you just need 3 of them. And then if you also have your own key vault, remember you don't need this key vault. The only thing I need when I need a key vault is I need these secret names and I need the key vault name. So whatever your key vault's called, if you have a global master key vault, call it global master key vault, and then make sure you have these secrets listed in here, or just change this based upon your naming standard. So that's all the pieces contained inside the YAML and inside the repo. So I will show you how to set up the source control integration for your workspace in a video. And then I think that will wrap up everything you need to do Databricks DevOps. Thanks for watching.